This was one of the most terrifying and absurd cases of Stalin's final years. At the very beginning of 1953, just 2 months before his death, newspapers across the country published a sensational statement. A group of killer doctors had been uncovered in the USSR who allegedly secretly poisoned and treated to death party and army leaders. Official texts stated that the doctors were working on behalf of foreign intelligence services to eliminate the Soviet elite. The accusations were terrifying. Doctors who had treated Stalin, Zhdanov, Shcherbakov, Vlasic, and other high-ranking officials for many years were suddenly declared spies, saboteurs, and secret murderers. Moreover, emphasis was placed on the fact that almost all of them were Jewish. The case immediately received support at the highest levels, and a campaign of hatred began in the newspapers. The investigators worked quickly and ruthlessly. 37 doctors were named in the case files. 17 of them were arrested, and 15 were tortured. They were beaten, deprived of sleep for several days, kept in the cold, and threatened with reprisals against their families. The main goal was to obtain the necessary confessions. One of the doctors could not withstand the interrogations and died in prison from torture. His body was never returned to his family. The accusations were so absurd that even some of the investigators had doubts, but orders from above were not to be questioned. The authorities were preparing the country for a new wave of repression, and the doctor's case was to be the starting point. By the beginning of 1953, Stalin was already very old and ill, but most importantly, he trusted no one. He suspected conspiracies literally everywhere. He was concerned that there were too many irreplaceable people around him who were beginning to develop their own connections and influence. And it was at this moment that the so-called doctor's case appeared. In fact, Stalin did not just need doctors, he needed a reason, a high-profile and terrifying case to restart the mechanism of fear. He had done this before, first with the army, then with the party leadership. Now it was time for a new target, the Jews, especially those who worked close to the authorities. Scientists, doctors, engineers. He wanted to show that the enemy was sitting nearby, treating, listening, and then killing. Therefore, the doctor's case was part of a much larger plan. A draft decree was found in the archives, according to which all Jews were to be evicted from Moscow, literally, for the sake of state security. This would not have been a simple transfer, but a mass resettlement, as had been done before with other peoples. But where exactly? According to the plan discussed in February 1953, a new gulag was to be created in Kazakhstan. It was intended specifically for doctors and other unreliable people. There, in distant camps, they would have disappeared without a trace. All this was prepared in secret, but the documents remained. Stalin did not plan to limit himself to the arrests of doctors. He was going to start a new wave of repression, possibly the last in his lifetime, and the doctor's case was to be the start. He hoped that fear would once again force everyone to obey, and that possible competitors would be eliminated in advance. But the plan was too ambitious and too cruel. On the 5th of March 1953, Joseph Stalin died. It was a shock for the whole country, but first and foremost for those around him. Those who had feared every call from the Kremlin just yesterday suddenly realized that the rules of the game were changing. And the first thing to come under attack was the doctor's case. Behind the scenes, a struggle for power began. Everyone had their own interests, but one thing united almost everyone. No one wanted Stalin's repressions to continue in this form. The doctor's case had become too dangerous. If everything was left as it was, tomorrow those who had signed the accusations themselves could be arrested. Therefore, they began to hastily put the brakes on it. Just 5 days after Stalin's death, the interrogation records of the doctors were suddenly removed from the prosecutor's office. Without explanation, some of the documents disappeared forever. Investigators who had recently been extracting confessions began to hint that it was better to remain silent. The charges were no longer discussed at meetings, and then something strange happened. The chief investigator in the case, Syrov, died. The official version, he fell down the stairs at his home. But many in the MGB said that he knew too much and could talk. His death remained classified as accidental, although it still raises many questions. The arrested doctors were still in prison, but no one was in a hurry to hold a trial or read out the verdict. The country was frozen in anticipation. The new leaders were trying to decide whether to leave everything as it was or admit that the case was a mistake. The problem was that admitting a mistake meant striking a blow against Stalin himself. After Stalin's death, a redistribution of power began at the top. Everyone was afraid of losing influence, and everyone was pulling the blanket over themselves. But Lavrentiy Beria proved to be the most active. He unexpectedly began to advocate for change. For a man known as one of the main organizers of the repressions, this was extremely unexpected. Beria quickly regained control of the Ministry of Internal Affairs and began to act. His first high-profile decision was to stop the doctor's case. This was not humanism, but cold calculation. He understood that if he quickly canceled the case while others were confused, he could gain the image of a savior and reformer, and thus strengthen his power. On April 4th, 1953, less than a month after Stalin's death, Beria signed an order to release all the arrested doctors. No trial, no excuses, just an order. Release them immediately. For them, it was like a miracle. After months of interrogation and torture, they were suddenly free. But true freedom never came. Most of the doctors were in shock. Months of interrogations, humiliation, and torture had left their mark. Some could not speak normally and refused to communicate even with their loved ones. They lived with the feeling that at any moment it would all start again. A few people were able to return to work. They were allowed to treat patients again. But the conditions were different now. They were constantly monitored, their social circle was carefully checked, and they were not allowed to leave Moscow. They were not allowed to speak openly about their experiences. The worst thing was that none of the investigators, prosecutors, or journalists who had accused them apologized. The whole system simply pretended that nothing had happened. People were torn from their lives, broken, and then returned as if nothing had happened. That was how this story ended for the doctors. Not with triumph, but with silence. They survived, but lived with a stigma until their deaths. It was only decades later that the state acknowledged their innocence. But Beria did not stop there. He went further and began arresting the investigators who had handled the case. In just 1 month, more than 20 MGB employees who had participated in the torture were detained on his orders. These were people whom everyone had feared until recently, and now they themselves were under investigation. Such a sharp turnaround frightened many in the Kremlin. Too sharp, too bold. But Beria wanted to show that everything would be different now. He was going to demolish not only the old case, but also the very system on which Stalin's power was based. However, this liberation was not just a show of humanism. Beria had his own calculations, his own goal, and it was much deeper. Beria understood perfectly well that the one who would survive was the one who would be the first to show that he could rule in a new way. Therefore, he began to act sharply so that he would be remembered. The release of the doctors was a convenient way for him to show, "I am not like Stalin. I am better. I can put an end to the horror." This was the image of a strong reformer, and that is exactly how he wanted to appear in the eyes of the people and the elite. He presented himself as a fighter for justice, even though he himself had been organizing similar cases for years. But that's not all. Beria planned to go further. He wanted to change the system itself. abolish mass denunciations, reduce the powers of the KGB, restore more freedom to the economy, and even begin a discussion of the national question, including the fate of Jews in the USSR. All this seemed too radical for those around him. The release of the doctors was only the first step. Beria began to prepare reforms that frightened all the other members of the Politburo, especially Khrushchev. After all, if Beria managed to take control of the situation first, he would become the leader of a new era. And when Beria began to rapidly change the situation, at first everyone remained silent. But this silence was not one of approval. On the contrary, panic broke out among the top leadership of the USSR. Those who had previously served Stalin alongside him now began to fear that Beria was reaching for absolute power. He acted too abruptly. In a few weeks, Beria canceled dozens of Stalin's decisions and started talking about freedom, the rights of the republics, and the review of repressions. He looked as if he was ready to build a completely different USSR and to do it alone. This meant that everyone else, Khrushchev, Malenkov, Bulganin, could be left with nothing. As early as May 1953, secret meetings of the Central Committee members began without Beria. They gathered behind closed doors, without minutes. They discussed only one thing: how to stop him. He frightened them all. He knew too much. He had connections in the Ministry of Internal Affairs, he had compromising information, and he knew how to use it all. What was particularly worrying was that Beria had begun to punish those who had previously carried out his orders, investigators and MGB officers. In other words, tomorrow he could start imprisoning generals and ministers. One of Malenkov's reports stated outright that Beria was allegedly preparing an anti-party coup. He was no longer called comrade. He was called a threat. Those who had recently worked shoulder to shoulder with him were now plotting against him. But they had to act quickly. As long as Beria had power, he could strike first, and he had all the resources to do so. The Ministry of Internal Affairs, army guards, documents, blackmail. Everything was done quietly, without publicity. The plan was prepared quickly and secretly, so that he would not have time to strike first. On June 26, 1953, a meeting of the Presidium of the Central Committee was held. Beria arrived there, as usual, confident in himself. He did not know that the majority had already agreed in advance. As soon as he began to speak, Zhukov and army officers entered the hall and arrested him on the spot. No one resisted. It all lasted a few minutes. Beria did not even understand what was happening. He was taken to a detention center, and from that moment on, he disappeared from the political scene. The trial was closed. It was not even a real trial, but a meeting of a special commission. The charges included espionage, conspiracy, abuse of power, and even violence. But the main charge was anti-party activity. This was how they justified the removal of one of the most influential people after Stalin. On 23 December 1953, Lavrentiy Beria was executed. Along with him, 6 of his closest associates were also executed. The location of his burial was kept secret. His name was removed from all books and archives, and in official history, he became an enemy of the people. On the one hand, the doctor's case was closed, and people were saved. On the other hand, the entire system of repression remained almost unchanged, just with new faces. And Beria, who tried to seize power, became the first and most prominent victim of the new era. It was a terrible, harsh, and lightning-fast coup. Without protests, without rallies, without shots fired, but with a complete purge. Thus ended the story of a man who was feared even under Stalin. But in the end, his own people became afraid and removed him.